Virginia. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it greatly. Let me get the record a little bit straight because I think it was confused a little bit earlier. While we had criminal conduct by NECC, we also had timid lawyers at the FDA. Ohio had warned the FDA there was a problem. Colorado had outright banned NECC from putting products into their state, and FDA was aware of it and didn't even bother to seek a warrant to go in and see what was going on. So as we move forward, let's continue on that. Also, I think in the next panel, there'll be some question about the intent, and you touched on that in your testimony with Mr. Shimkus a little bit earlier. But I want to go back to when the bill passed in September of 2013. At that time, now Ranking Member Green said, in part, while I believe the FDA dropped the ball with regards to the NECC, with this law they must succeed where in the past they failed, and I know you're working hard on that. This bill still lacks clarity in many important areas: office use, how nuclear pharmacies are regulated, and repackaging of sterile products. I look forward to working with my colleagues to provide meaningful oversight of the FDA to make sure another NECC-type outbreak never happens again, and make sure they are using the type of enforcement discretion necessary to preserve patients' access to critical medicine. In that same press release, because it was a bipartisan effort, as you've heard earlier, Mr. Green, myself, and Ms. DeGette worked hard on trying to get this portion of the DQSA right and to the best of our ability, although we had some disagreements with our Senate colleagues. I said on that occasion that the Drug Quality and Security Act leaves a large portion of existing law intact. It also leaves many areas of practice where clarification may still be needed, particularly as it relates to office use, repackaging, and nuclear pharmacies. Along with my colleagues, I will continue working to oversee the FDA's interpretation and implementation of this law. And I think that's what we're doing today. Some folks have characterized this, because I'm leading the push for office use, as, you know, wanting to undo everything that DQSA stood for. Obviously, I wouldn't have drafted it and fought hard along with my colleagues to get it if that was my intent. But I do have questions, and one of those was raised by your testimony to Mr. Shimkus in answering his questions, where you indicated that twice they had decided that you had to have a prescription in order to issue a drug, and that Congress had made that decision. But I'm looking at 503A, little a, to big A, and it says, you know, is one of the things, it says, or is by a licensed pharmacist or licensed physician in limited quantities before the receipt of a valid prescription order for such individual patient. Obviously, the law, and that was the old law, which was not changed, and which we were assured that the practices weren't going to change at the time as we were negotiating this, by folks in the Senate saying they didn't want to do this because the FDA wasn't going to change anything. It clearly anticipates that in some cases, you won't have a prescription until afterwards. We had debated, you know, making sure that a prescription was written within 7 days at the time that we were negotiating it. But this seemed acceptable at the time, and the reason that I put that into my statement, and others may have put it in their statement, and my statement on the floor was, we were given the assurance that office use was going to remain pretty much the same, and for 503A pharmacies, I think that's important. So how do you rectify that you think there needs to be a prescription with the actual wording of the law? It references few references in the next section.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I appreciate your longstanding dedication to this issue and your longstanding work on it, and you and I have had time to talk about this on many occasions. With respect to the nuclear pharmacies, I'll just say we'll be putting out a guidance that will specifically address radiopharmaceuticals. But in respect to your specific question about the language you quoted, I believe that language, and we believe that language was contemplating anticipatory compounding, basically compounding on an expectation that you were going to receive a certain volume of prescriptions. Because as we know with the 503A pharmacies, and I know you're very familiar with the practice of pharmacy, and sometimes when you mix up one batch, it's more economic. When you're mixing up a batch, you can't just mix up one drug. You mix up 10 at a time or 15 at a time. And you can do that if there's an expectation that you know you get 30 prescriptions a month or 40 prescriptions a month, so we allow for that. And in what we've said in guidance is that you can mix up a level of volume in anticipation of what your prescriptions might be over the course of a 30-day period to provide that kind of flexibility. That's what I believe the statutory language that you referenced was anticipating,
And-
which we've allowed for.
And I disagree, just based on the debate that we had when we were doing this a number of years ago in 2013, because we anticipated there would be continued office use, and that's why we were looking at putting in the 7-day requirement. And as Ms. DeGette said, there's got to be a balance. As Mr. Shimkus said, we're worried about rural areas. I do appreciate that you're concerned about the state lines because, you know, having now been made famous by the Geico commercial where the lizard jumps from Tennessee to Virginia and back and forth and back and forth, that's my district. And so you've got a pharmacy on either side of that state line, and I mean, you know, you just turn around, you've crossed the state line. And the other day I was traveling in my district, and I went from Virginia to West Virginia to Virginia to West Virginia, back to Virginia, then ended up the day going from Virginia to Tennessee, back into Virginia, back into Tennessee, and then back home in Virginia, just to try to talk to my constituents and do what I need to do. So I appreciate you paying attention to that as you look at the flexibility side, but I really believe that the existing law allows for some office use from the smaller folks. We were trying to get to the big guys and the larger guys because of the NECC problem, which was shipping into all the states, not just across the Tennessee line or the Virginia line.
I understand and appreciate concerns, Congressman, and the impact on small pharmacies.
And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. And